Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this session. This session is about probably the most juicy topic in AI right now, evals. And I have two friends with me, and we'll be doing a panel on the topic. Rachitt is an AI consultant and a very good friend. He has extensive experience in evaluation, and he's led evals for a bunch of different companies for over the past 1 or 2 years. And Claire is the head of customer AI solutions engineering at Comet, a friend as well. And I felt these two folks are just the best to talk about this topic. Without wasting time, I'll get started. Maybe I want to do an icebreaker and ask both of you what exactly are evals and how are they even different from test cases or traditional machine learning evaluations, and what's your one sentence explanation of what evals are? I'll probably let Rachitt take it first.
Absolutely. So the way I see evaluations is that earlier when, of course, evaluations are not something that's new. We've had evaluations for traditional ML workflows as well. It's not like you're inventing something that was never existing. The way we are doing evaluations has changed drastically. Earlier, you could just define deterministic metrics. For example, anyone who comes from a traditional NLP world will understand that you can just have your F1 scores, your Rook scores, your Blue scores, and stuff like that. These days, that's not the case. You're dealing with APIs, you're dealing with language, you're dealing with text to SQL, you're dealing with agents, you're dealing with memory, you're dealing with search. How do we put all of this together? So the best one-liner explanation I would have about evaluations is that you are programming, you are effectively evaluating language. You are not evaluating anything else at that point. It's pure play intent evaluations is what I would call it. So, yeah.
Awesome. That's pretty cool. Claire, you work for a company that's all about evals. So what's your take on this?
Yes, I love evals. I spent a lot of time working with them. I think your definition was excellent. There's not too much I can add to that. I think that the way I think about evals is it's categorically a metric that's really used for language model evaluation. And that metric could be a language-based metric or a heuristic. And that's where things get quite interesting, and we can really start to be creative with how we define these. Because coming from more traditional machine learning background, I would think about eval metrics as like accuracy, F1 scores, like it's just very numeric. You just calculate it directly. But these LLM evals are taking a step further where like maybe it's a prompt that's outputting a label, things like that. So it's a little bit more of a creative definition of a metric in my mind, but definitely also customizable.
Awesome. Makes sense. Maybe one question I would want to get started with is, an LLM generates a response. You have a chatbot or you have any other system that's probably powered by an AI model, and the responses look good to me, then why do I need evals? I can just check 4 or 5 responses. They look good, put it into production. Why is there so much hype on having evals at all? Maybe Rachitt, I'll let you go.
So a couple of reasons, right? So yes, in the last 2 years, models have improved drastically, but at the same time, these are probabilistic systems. It's like you don't want to play dice with a model that is going to be deployed to multiple users, whether you're a B2B application or B2C application. There have been instances last year, this year, drastic reduction thanks to evals going mainstream. But last year, Chevy sold a Silverado car traditionally worth about $90,000 for $1. Amazon Q, not Amazon Q, a bunch of Amazon chatbots, Rufus, if I remember correctly, had flagged a lot of racism, had a lot of bias when it came to review. In one instance, I remember that Rufus was actually writing JavaScript code. So these are like a couple of product-first metrics that matter. If you're a PM or if you're an applied AI engineer to actually get into evals. The other part is that you don't really again, there's a lot of hacks, I would call them. They're flimsy at best. Is that reduce temperatures, have the best prompts. So there's no way to actually get a sense of where you're headed. The next and final point before I convert this session into an essay is that there's a very major bridge, or not even a bridge. There's a very major gap between what the product building team wants and what a customer wants. The business KPIs and the engineering KPIs are not on the same page. Evals is your best bet in an AI first world to get business and engineering on the same page about where you're headed, and what are the engineering outcomes and what are the product or business outcomes that that your products are going to deliver to your users.
Awesome. That kind of brings me to the next question that probably Claire can answer, which I think Rachitt said, the builders and the customers don't have aligned outcomes, and you've led a lot of customer solutions. So how do you kind of bridge that, and what are the patterns you've been seeing?
Yeah, so you're thinking about kind of that situation where there's multiple teams involved, maybe customers as well, and kind of bridging that like communication between the teams as they're building.
Oh, is that a question for Rachitt?
Yeah, I was just trying to make sure I understand the question right.
Oh, I was getting at this, that Rachitt mentioned that a customer comes to you with certain business metrics that they want to improve, but then builders don't have that mindset, right? Because they're not really concerned about business metrics, but more about, system metrics or stuff that the machine learning system is producing as the output. And Rachitt mentioned that evals are a way that you could bridge that. You could connect both of these components. Have you seen that happen often, and how hard is it to achieve?
Absolutely. I think the bigger the organization, the harder it is, because every team is held to their own metrics. But the most effective, high quality projects that I've seen go to production do bridge this gap. So you might have a data science research team, you might have an engineering team, then you have a product team that's maybe hold the business metrics, and you have the customer that maybe has their own goals as they're using the tool. And the best products that I've ever seen look at the overall system as a whole, and they look at it kind of from the customer perspective, and that drives the metrics. And then I see the teams, like maybe the data scientist researcher, as well as the machine learning or AI engineer, also kind of peeking up above their own team metrics and looking at what those business metrics are, and then correlating that back down to what they're really looking at day to day. And I think it can kind of be easy as like a developer getting lost in the code because it's just right in front of you all the time. But taking that step back and thinking about, okay, how do I actually take these metrics that I'm trying to optimize day to day and correlate that back to like the bigger picture of the project? That's really kind of like, it's more of like a skill set that I see on these teams, and the evals definitely help people do it properly.
One small point to add before we continue is that I also believe to some degree is evals are also an org design problem to an extent, because of the disconnect, as Claire rightly pointed out, about different teams having different metrics. So I do believe from an org design standpoint, they're also an org design problem, frankly. And I've seen it with multiple teams because Claire's job is effectively to make sure customers succeed. My business relies on making sure customers fail. So I've seen that org design absolutely is another problem that comes up.
That makes a lot of sense. Maybe I'll throw back that question at you, Rachitt. If Chevy came to you to say, design the chatbot for us, how would you go about thinking of evals, or how would you just design the entire process to make sure that it doesn't go off guardrails or suggest anything that's not expected from the customer?
So the number one thing that I see teams do, before even we touch the fundamentals of evals, I'd like to bridge a couple of other points, right? Small mistakes I've seen teams do. Since the focus in AI today is shipping velocity, people first of all have misaligned incentives. Second is that teams don't really look at their data at all. For example, Meta has a synthetic QA kit, Ragas has their synthetic QA generator, a bunch of these metrics. So the first thing that you need to do, even before you write a single line of code, is spec out what your data is going to look like. What's the ideal user behavior you're expecting? What is the ideal model behavior you're expecting? This gives you a very strong benchmark to start your POC with. I was discussing this with a colleague recently, and me and him had this chat, and we came to the conclusion that 90% of AI projects fail because there's no incentive to do evals for them. With evals, I've seen more projects go to success than anything else. How would I start? I would first understand that what are we trying to build. The next thing I would do, I would not do engineering. I'll just put on my data science hat, and I would just build a lot of synthetic data first. I would bucket my data into the right workflows that I'm going after. I would replicate a user behavior, and I would start creating a small eval set. This gives me clarity in terms of costs, in terms of prompts, in terms of memory, function calling, MCP integrations, you name it. I have a standard to test how my implementation works. So that's ideally how I would go start doing this. TLDR, always look at your data. Data is the lifeblood of AI.
That makes a lot of sense. I think look at your data has been kind of super, has been a big revelation for so many software engineers that are moving to this space. I think something that I want to point out here is for companies that are moving for 0 to 1 use cases, right, where they never used AI before, getting access to data is kind of hard. And also with the synthetic data generation process, it's sometimes hard for you to imagine the user experience if you've never run a system before, right? What kind of things do both of you do in order to make sure that you understand the user journey very well? Do you communicate with other folks on the team? Like, how do you make that happen as a builder? Because as an engineer, you're probably heads down designing these things. So how do you understand user experience?
I'm happy to take that one first. This is a really good question because something I've noticed throughout my career, some of the best engineers and data scientists are doing exactly what you're saying. The ones who have like the most impact on their projects and their teams, they take a step back and they understand like the end-to-end actual user journey of whatever they're building or the business impact if it's an internal tool. And the best method that I've seen people employ in their careers to do that is actually to just go make friends. And I know that's a little bit hard when we're working remote, but those subject matter experts that understand deeply where your AI tool is being plugged in, whether it's the end user or somebody who would be a customer, they're going to have perspective that you don't have as an AI expert. And you need to kind of code their perspective into whatever AI tool you're building. And so actually just getting to know those folks and understanding how they're thinking about the problem from a non-technical perspective can really help impact how you work and how you measure what you're building.
Absolutely. And actually, we have, just to follow up on this, we have a question in the chat that actually talks about, who do you think has a final say on metrics for evals? The org or the subject matter experts in case of vertical agents? What changes when orgs decide to do new evals using SMEs? So I think this is a fantastic question, purely in terms of answering to bridge a gap between synthetic data and live production data. I personally believe it should be a very strong 80% split of subject matter experts and 20% split of builders. The subject matter expert knows the data, you know the metrics and how to implement it. Listening to the subject matter expert will make your job easier because if you're a builder, you would more or less figure it out. So that's my take on the answer. And Aishwarya, to answer your question, right? I personally think that having a very strong data science mindset to evals. I personally think it's a very nice Venn diagram of a product engineer and a data scientist. Actually, more than a product engineer, it's more of a QA engineer and a data scientist is the more relevant Venn diagram to create. So I think those an amalgamation of those two roles is the best way to approach that problem.
Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. I think I want to dive a little into implementation now, right? You've gathered your data set. Let's say you spoke to a bunch of subject matter experts and all of you have aligned that these are the evaluation metrics that you want to go ahead with. What do you do after that? How do you design your solution and how do you implement metrics? I know metrics like accuracy, F-score, and all of that are too unidimensional to do anything for LLM-based systems. So how do you go about designing these metrics and implementing them?
That's a good question.
Claire, you can take it.
You want me to go first? I got some ideas there, but I'm really curious to hear from other folks. So the way I go about it is the first thing I actually do is I log my system. So I'll start logging the traces. I want to know exactly what spans are within the trace. I really want to have that data schema of what is my system, every step through the system. And then I start looking at that log and identifying where the potential breaking points would be. And that's where I'm going to place evals. I'm going to have an eval on the system overall, but also the steps that could be potential root causes. If something goes wrong in production, then I can pinpoint the issue to the exact step in my system. So that's kind of the thought process there. I also find that creating evals is quite iterative. I might put something out there and it starts seeing new patterns in data that it hasn't seen from earlier. And then I'm like, oh, I need to eval this and I need to eval that. So it is a little bit iterative. I wish I could get to the place where I just knew everything I need to test for and monitor for before it's live. But I think that's kind of the beauty of like beta testing and internal tests and things like that.
The only thing I would add here is that I personally like to design evals that actually fail. I do not want 100% coverage on all of my evals at all. If I'm designing an eval set that has 100% correctness, I'm overfitting. There's no point in overfitting in a production system. Uh, the only metric I try to optimize for is that I try to use the eval as a error filter that comes up in a production scale system. The harder the eval, the less the chances of something slipping through the gap is. Of course, it's not going to be 100% all the time, but even if you're like 70-80% of your eval is passing and a 20% is not passing yet, that means your team is incrementally heading in the right direction. Anything that passes 100% is not an eval, you're overfitting, is what I have a very strong bias towards.
That makes a lot of sense. Maybe I'll take a very simple example. Let's say you have a summary generating pipeline. Let's say you're building a meeting summarizer or something like that, right? Now, this is a use case where I cannot use stuff like exact match because the same summary can be rephrased in multiple ways. What are some evals that you would design in this case, and how would you design them? Are they binary, or are you going to be using some form of AI judges to identify these? Just curious how you'll go through that process. Rachitt, you can pick it up because you were already, I think you got started on the topic.
Okay, sure. So ideally, since a meeting summarizer is more probabilistic in nature, because again, we are dealing with language. Had it been a function call, we could have gone after more of a heuristic-based approach combined with an LLM as a judge. The number one thing I would ideally go after is that design the right metrics. For example, if there's a meeting summary, meeting summaries are effectively map reduce at scale. The number one thing that I want to keep in mind for designing a judge for this would most likely be consistency. Is the tone consistent? Am I missing anything? Next is summarization accuracy. Is that, for example, I can just have the logical chunks. I can just build a very simple IDF pipeline to understand the keywords, create a labeling cluster, and pull only parts of that segment and check, is the consistency there? Next would be, most likely I would go for something like a faithfulness or what do we say? Hallucination checker. So take the ground truth, index it, have a search pipeline running on top of it, and then get an answer. So there's efficiency gains you can directly measure based on a transcript the user does a direct keyword-based search. The next thing, that probably last thing I would do, is that I would tie all of this up together into an LM harness of sorts, because each metric on their own does not tell me much. All of these metrics combined to my application tells me the most. And finishing touches that I always recommend teams to do is to have things around your user analytics baked in. For example, a very simple user analytics test I would go after is that, how many times did the user copy-paste my transcript? How many times did they edit my transcript? How many follow-up questions did they ask my transcript? Because this gives me an understanding of my user's behavior and what are the things that my judges are not considering and what are the edge cases. Like I said, I want to design an eval that fails. My job is not to design an eval that passes. So that's how I would pragmatically approach this.
Awesome. Rachit just gave away a bunch of metrics for meeting summarizers. We got some of his consulting time. Claire, do you want to add something to that?
I think that's a fantastic eval strategy. My answer would honestly be very similar.
Awesome. Rachit, I want to dig a little deeper on the kind of metrics that you mentioned, right? I think some of them are pretty cheap to implement, but some of them also require additional LLM calls and all of this. So when you're designing metrics for companies, how do you really think of the cost itself? Because AI evals are probably as expensive as running the pipeline sometimes, and you don't want to be just shelling out so much money on evals.
Absolutely. So the number one thing, again, before I dive into the technicals, right? Number one thing that matters is educating the software before the hardware, the software as in humans, that this is important, and telling them that, hey, this will actually solve problems for you. So because this is a very important step that I have seen, because as you rightly said, right, that if you're trying to trace back, like if you have a multi-turn conversation, you'll most likely need to evaluate each node of the conversation. So that's twice as expensive. That works. So ideally, initially, what I prefer doing is having the same models, or if since for everyone there's something called LMSys, which has model ELOs on different benchmarks. So I usually prefer starting off with the same ELO models. That not necessarily have to be the same model. Like I can use a Sonnet 4 to evaluate a 4.0 or vice versa. I want models in the same model class to evaluate these models. Post this, I will have some data, some iteration, some form of metrics that I can look at. For scale, one of my favorite tricks to do is go after prompt optimization. There's multiple libraries. TextGuard is one of them. There's VSPy. There's a bunch of these libraries that are existing. The next thing to do, and this is something that I personally have observed, is that if you're actually having the right prompts, if you're tuning them right, you can get very comparable results to a higher ELO model. Again, no one's asking you to do a reasoning evaluation here, or something like a browser use evaluation here. This is pure play text that needs to be evaluated. So that's one of the best ways to reduce the cost of evals at scale. The best approach to reduce costs is not actually to go after cheaper models, in my opinion. The right answer, the underlooked element again here, is analytics. You need to understand a user drop-off rate. Like for example, let's take another practical example, right? Very common, chatbots. How many follow-up questions did the user have? Did the user drop off mid-conversation? If the user did drop off mid-conversation or probably hurled profanity at my chatbot, that means something did not work. I can just pull up those analytics. I can run eval on only those sections. So that's a very great way for you to subsidize your costs while hitting the pain points of your problem. Because things that are working, they will pass in your CI/CD. If you have added evals in your CI/CD, something I highly recommend everyone to do, either way. But if you don't have some heuristic-based metrics to understand what's failing, your eval is just going to go haywire. Because one of the things I've observed is that, like I said, we are dealing with language. We are not at the point that we are just dealing with an API and I can write a test set for this. User behavior is going to be extremely different for different parts of your project. So getting all of this together is, I think, the slice of the problem.
That makes a lot of sense. Claire, maybe I want to pick your brain on this, because evals are evolving so quickly. And just like Rachit said, there are all these custom things that folks are doing, right? So when you work for a place like Comet, I would think it's so hard to bring together metrics that are useful for people who are currently, working on these projects. How do you folks prioritize which metrics should be brought on board and all of that? I just feel like there's so much out there, and how do you actually know what people are using?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It's been really fun to see what kind of evals people build with OPIC within Comet. OPIC is our open source framework for building evals. The way we've approached this is like there's some standard out-of-the-box evals that just address things that LLMs do all the time, like hallucinations. We're always going to be worried about that, fairness and bias issues. So we've crafted some really great prompts that you can just use out of the box to detect those kind of standard issues. But then the fascinating thing that I've seen is that every business use case has these own kind of really unique issues that could go wrong. Like the GM issue where they sold the Chevy Tahoe for $1 through the customer chatbot. Like that's something that like only a car sales chatbot is going to have an issue with. And so it's very difficult to come up with like a standard eval for something like that. And so what we've created is what we call G-eval, which is a framework where you can layer your own evaluation prompt on top of the traces that you're already logging. So you already have that data schema. And you can really just craft your own custom eval for any specific use case that or issue that you're worried about. And for my own projects, this has been really useful because I'm building like recipe generators, poker coaching chatbots, and those all have their own kind of edge case use cases that like I could not measure the issues that would arise there if I just had a standard eval. So it's kind of a mix between like out of the box for the really standard stuff and then just allowing full customization for the more challenging issues.
Makes a lot of sense.
Just one thing I'd like to add on Claire's point, right, is that when teams actually start hitting production, designing your evals around your business KPIs is the best approach. That's the custom metrics that Claire was talking about. So that actually I've seen that that actually helps teams a lot more than any prompts out of the box, because like I mentioned earlier, evals is also an org design problem. If you design an eval that again won't make everyone happy, but everyone understands, you will have everyone on the same page faster.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense. I think where I see this fit in is for teams that have never done evals before. Tools like Opic just get you started, right? Because it has a prompt and then you can start running some evals. And then like Rachitt mentioned, those are not the ones that you want to keep all along. You want to keep updating them. You want to understand your problem and update them. Another question that's kind of always confusing for folks is, when do you decide to have something as a guardrail versus an eval, right? They're so close. Even the Chevy example, it could have just been a very strong guardrail. So how do you make that call? Claire, maybe you can take it and then Rachitt can follow up.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think of evals in the context of more like monitoring for an issue. And then if something goes wrong, I'm maybe going to go debug an issue, or maybe I'm going to go do some prompt engineering. So the eval is really going into that monitoring pipeline, but it could also detect something that you want to place a guardrail around. And I would think of a guardrail, I think of actually like blocking or changing the behavior that the LLM is trying to take. So when I actually want to like route things and affect the user experience like that, it's got to be like kind of a breaking change, I guess is how I think about it. So I'm really concerned about like fairness or bias issues. Like I want guardrails on that. Like I don't want to just like that to go to production and then we'll go debug it later. That's like, you have to stop it immediately. So I'm looking for those kinds of use cases where it's like, I'm actually going to interfere with the output of the LLM and block it or route it to some kind of default. And that's always going to go to like kind of those business critical or ethical issues.
Makes sense. Rachitt, do you want to add to that?
My answer is slightly different. My very core belief is that you should start with both guardrails and LLM evals. Guardrails are effectively, I do not consider guardrails as a separate entity. I actually consider them more of a subset of LLM evals. My approach is more dependent on the use case rather than when to put them in. The ideal time is right when you're writing a PRD for your project. Is the best time to put it in. The second best time is after a user makes a complaint that something went wrong. So I usually think
proactive and reactive.
Yeah, reactive. I like it.
So I used to be an SRE, so a good old SRE analogies. So the other point that I personally think on guardrails is that it's also dependent on the type of applications, right? Like for example, I was working with a team recently, wanted to build a Glean, but for internal workflows of their own. And they wanted to add RBAC to their workflows. So now on an RBAC level, you need to have it from the infrastructure, right from the infra. So what we did is that we gave guardrails right to the orchestrator layer, that, hey, this is the user group that is going to get access to XYZ knowledge clusters. Anyone else gets access to it, you explicitly block it. And if you're building B2C, the Chevy example is a classic. But even for OpenAI and stuff like that, they most likely have guardrails baked into your model, into their workflows. So the type of guardrails also matter a lot more. From an enterprise first context, I personally think that security is the biggest concern, rather than anything that has to do with profanity or harassment, because models inherently, unless you're going for a jailbreak model, they are not going to go after these problems that guardrails effectively solve for. So my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Again, I think Rachit mentioned multi-turn conversations, and that's also a very hot topic in evals right now, right? Because if your agent or your AI system, whatever, is having multi-turn conversations and finally has gotten to the right answer, it might be possible that the turns that it has taken is not optimal. Maybe it's taken 10 turns instead of 5, or maybe the trajectory is not what you were looking at. How do you go about evaluating these multi-turn traces? Claire.
Yeah, I think, again, it's a combination of monitoring and evals. I'm going to monitor the number of turns, and that's something I can just graph over time and like see if like, hey, it's really going in loops here to get to a final answer. That could be frustrating to the user. So that's kind of an easy numeric metric there. But then I think the key kind of goes here to evaluating the goal of the conversation, because that's probably going to be like a multi-agent system where maybe there's a few LLM calls. You probably got good evals on that, but the user came to that conversation with a goal, and was that goal accomplished? So crafting some kind of custom eval around that and evaluating that at the conversation level, I think is key there.
Makes a lot of sense. Rachit, do you want to add?
I'm absolutely aligned on with Claire, right? That the convergence or number of steps taken is like the pivot metric that we should consider. I also think that if you're having a multi-turn conversation, let's assume something like a Claude Code, which is a tool that almost everyone uses today. One of the things that could matter a lot more is tool selection evals. A lot of times when you're doing, when Claude is trying to read a file, it does a grep. Sometimes it does a read file, sometimes it does a grep. Both of them effectively solve the same problem, but at the same time, both of them are different tools. So one of the other deterministic metrics that I really like is tool selection evals. In tools as well, there's multiple parameters you need to select. So parameter selection evals are also extremely critical there. After this, finally, I just think that running a trace and having the most optimal happy path and benchmarking that to all of your multi-turn conversations in a pure parity manner is one of the best ways to go about it. One of my favorite resources on this, in fact, is Berkeley function calling leaderboard. We just came out with a V4 recently. That's one of the best ways if anyone's looking to learn to understand how to do multi-turn evals. So yeah.
Awesome. That's on the tool calling and multi-turn conversations. Another area where evals are really hard to get right is RAG, right? Just the retrieval part of things, because the assumption is that you have a clean data set where you know what is the right chunk to be retrieved, but more often than not in real world settings, you don't have that. So how do you go about evaluating retrieval with all of this context precision, context recall, and all of that assume that a gold data set is available?
I'd like to take this one. So I actually think the problem should not exist if you have a golden data set or not, because the only thing that's more iterative than prompting is search. I actually, after LLM evals, like even before LLM evals, I think search is like the most critical thing that you can build, and you need to build it right all the time. I think everyone should start smaller. No, don't worry about context recall, context precision, MRR, a lot of these metrics, because end of the day, these are a lot of benchmark metrics. What matters from a pragmatic standpoint is only 2 things, in my opinion. What is your chunking strategy, and what is your vector dimensions? In my very honest opinion, what I've observed. Are you following logical chunking, length-based chunking, sequential chunking? What is your chunking going like? What are the vector dimensions? Everything else can be figured out, is what my take is. After this, then you come to your golden data set metrics, because once you have A/B tested the type of retrieval, the stages of retrieval, the steps of retrieval, you will inevitably at some point hit the perfect sweet spot that, okay, this is the point where it's working well. And you can freeze that as a checkpoint, like we have for model pre-training checkpoints. You can have that as a search checkpoint. Very simple, pragmatic way, just have a different GitHub branch and use that as a benchmark. Have that as a benchmark.
I'll quickly stop you there, Rachitt. Are you saying look at the final responses and that's how we evaluate which search parameters are working for you and then go to understanding retrieval? Okay. So look at the final output and just get to a point where it's doing decently fine and then start debugging where things are going off.
Absolutely. Like TLDR is look backwards. Don't try to look forwards because everyone knows where looking forward is. No one looks backward.
Awesome. Makes a lot of sense. Claire, do you want to add to that or I could do my next question?
Let's go to the next one. I think that's a good comprehensive answer there.
Awesome. Maybe I want to now talk a bit about the hype and what folks are doing. In both of your experiences, what incorrect patterns of evals have you observed and what's some advice you have for teams? I'll let Claire take this first.
Patterns and evals that I've observed, advice for teams. I think the first advice I would have for a team building any LLM system and they're working on creating the evals is understand the end use case. Whether that's a customer journey or internal business application, whatever it is, go make those friends in those other departments and understand how they're going to be using their tool and what their expectations are for it. And that's going to guide your eval strategy. In terms of like kind of interesting things in evaluating, building these evals, there's kind of two patterns that like I'm actively researching and trying to learn about. One of those is like whether or not the eval metrics should be, if it's an LLM as a judge, if it should be numeric or categorical, like a label or something. I lean more towards a label because these are language models. They're not always good at ranking things. We have other models that rank things very well. But that's kind of an open area that I'm kind of researching because I see people naturally just want to ask the LLM to say like, hey, give me a number between 1 or 10. But it may not be so good at that. And it might be very good at labeling things 0 or 1. So that's something I'm exploring. And then the other one is like, what model do you use for your LLM as a judge? Like, should we be fine tuning these models to be good at judging? Should we use a different model other than what generated our output? That's kind of an open question that I'm trying to dig into. So those are kind of the two areas that I would say if you're working on evals right now, like those topics should be top of mind, as well as just understanding the impact of what you're building and thinking of creative ways to measure that.
Awesome. I think one of Claire's point is kind of tempting me to digress. So there is this constant two sides to the same argument that I keep hearing, which is one set of folks always want to use Likert scales and the other, like, have classification because LLMs are not good at numbers. I think that was one of the open questions that Claire was getting at, right? Rachitt, what is your take on this? And can you also explain why you think that is the take, right? Because Likert scales were developed for a reason because you could throw a number at something. Why aren't LLMs great at that?
So,
or the other way around?
Yeah, a couple of reasons, right? Labeling is actually easier. It's more qualitative in nature. It gives you an RCA to some degree. Like you can understand that. Let's assume you have a scale 1 to 5 in terms of correctness. That 5 can be correct, but at the same time, it can be horribly wrong from a ground truth. Just because the model thinks it's correct.
But what if you forced your model to also reason out the score itself, right? You're giving me a 4, but tell me why you maybe did that -1. Would that still not work?
That in an ideal world where teams are playing with smaller data sets, yes, that would work. In a production scale environment, I'm looking at it from purely a production lens, not a experiment lens. I don't think that would work, right? Let's assume you are dealing with an application handling over 1,200 users. 12,000, 13,000 users a day. You're probably looking at MAUs over 300K a month. You are not going to be able to pull in the COTs or the reasoning from all of these, even if you split it by 1 to 4. There's no logical clustering that will happen, and you will not be able to find the false positives either at what's working and what's not working. I do think
The
it's
high level idea that I have, I want you to kind of argue against or support this, is the fact that if you do multiple classes, then you're assuming that you have all encompassing knowledge about these classes, right? Versus if you do a 1 to 5 scale, I'm assuming that there are things that I don't know, but the LLM might figure out, because if it gave a 4, then there are probably areas that I'm not aware about that the LLM can latch on to. Versus if I just said, class X is this, class Y is this, and class Z is this, and then I assume that I know everything about these classes. So what's both of your opinions on this?
I think this is why evals are iterative, because in that case, what I would do is 0, 1, or other. And then I'd want to ask it to explain the other, and then I might see these other classes pop out. And there might even be some kind of automatic feedback loop there where you can start to dynamically update your classes.
Okay, that makes sense.
The only point that I would like to build on is that the scale, right? Actually, I've worked on giving scales to LLM metrics a lot. So, like from a user analytics perspective, that Claire, I'm pretty sure you would relate here. A lot of times when you have data attenuation, users try to, like, internal subject matter experts also give thumbs up, thumbs down. There's no granularity that's captured, because an answer can be good. It could be a 3. The user still will give it a thumbs up. But at the same time, it does not capture the detail that, okay, this is the reason why it's going wrong. A label with an RCA can give me that. The scale leaves out a lot of the qualitative elements while making it quantitative. It's a good way to scale initially, but the what do we say, margin of diminishing returns comes into play very quickly in a production scale environment when you're looking at a scale versus when you're looking at a label.
Yeah, that's interesting. And there's also the idea of explanations, where if you are asking for a label, also ask for that explanation. And that might be where you're getting more nuanced details about what could be wrong that goes back into your system in a way to improve it.
Yeah. And we can take the label and take it downstream for multiple other workflows, right? Like, for example, search queries can be improved. My tool calling can be improved. My prompts themselves can be improved by prompt optimization, a bunch of other downstream metrics. I can look at my cost optimizations by having a better model, prompt a cheaper model in the same format. Like, one of the most evident examples for this is OpenAI models. It's no secret. OpenAI models prefer Markdown. Even after sometimes, even if you tell them structured outputs, they still give you Markdown. Versus Anthropic prefers XML. So you can just have that. Once you have the RCA of something that's failing, you can just have a model agnostic prompt created that you can use upstream and downstream, and that makes your job easier as an engineer.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. That's it from my side, but I think we'll take a bunch of questions from the audience here. I don't know if you folks have a preference, read it out and go for it. If not, I can pick something. Maybe there was one specifically for Claire. I can read that out. Claire, you said the most successful projects are system holistically and prioritize the customer perspective. How do you facilitate collaboration between data science, engineering, product teams, and customers to ensure evals are comprehensive and aligned to business goals? Can be another session on its own, but I'll let you.
That's a whole session right there. That's actually, I love that question, because I actually have a YouTube tutorial coming out this week on that exact topic. And what you need here is a tool to kind of bridge that communication gap. The kind of workflow that I've seen a lot is like a human subject matter expert is labeling some of the data, but that person can't label all the data. And that developer needs to understand that subject matter expert's reasoning and really learn from the data that they are labeling so they can kind of scale this out. So there's something here where there's this kind of AI human workflow, very human in the loop, where the subject matter expert is labeling some data, and then the developer is then taking that labeled data and then using that to inspire a LLM as a judge metric that is mimicking what the human would do. So then you have like a metric you can use more at scale that's going to tell you probably how a human would have labeled it if they were able to label all of it. But you have to, the way to build towards that is kind of iterative through this kind of relationship between subject matter expert and developer, and you need a tool in the middle to help collect that data. OPIC's very good at that, so I will drop a tutorial on my LinkedIn coming soon if you guys want to dive more into that.
Awesome. I think iterative is probably the most valuable word in
I
AI.
say it all the time.
Yes. Awesome. I think, Rachit, there was one for you. It's from Matthew. Rachit suggested pulling analytics to run evaluations only on problematic sections. Could you share an example of how you have used conversational analytics to reduce evaluation costs while still maintaining coverage of critical issues?
Absolutely. So I'll give a story. This is a Indian unicorn that I was working with last year. Uh, they had a customer support application that they did not have evals for. So again, the same point that I mentioned, you cannot run all the evals in production. You'll probably bankrupt yourself and get fired. Uh, you need to look at a lot of, so the simplest metric I went for is that what's the CSAT and the NPS looking like? Work with the product managers to define these metrics. We came down to some couple of the most simplistic metrics that are available. Has the user taken follow-on actions to the resolution that the model suggested? B, has the user dropped off from the chat? C, has the user given a negative response? Or have they raised the ticket to human escalation? We only went after these metrics. Now, I'll give an example how these metrics correlate to LLM as a judge. All of these effectively are telling you, A, the model is not selecting the right tools. B, the model does not have, your search is not working for business SOPs. C, it's telling that the consistency of your model is incorrect. And D, finally, it just tells you that there is no correlation between the user's query and the model. This is also important because you can then dump all the junk queries that come in this criteria and only go after the first three criteria that I mentioned. So that's why I'm reiterating that analytics are extremely critical when you're trying to build a production scale AI system. Analytics, in fact, post-production will be your best friends, and you won't be bankrupted when you're trying to do evals then. At that point, your evals become benchmarks, iterative benchmarks, nothing more.
Makes a lot of sense. There was one for Claire. On prioritizing which metrics to track, Claire mentioned out-of-the-box evals for hallucinations, fairness, and bias. How do you decide which of these standard metrics to emphasize for a new project? And when you do, I think the question got cut off. Let's maybe take it until that.
Yeah, this is a really good question. So there's some out-of-the-box metrics that I just always have on every project. That's going to be hallucination and then some kind of fairness or bias. Exactly what that one looks like, I think, can sometimes depend on the use case, but I really want to make sure that this is an ethical system and it's behaving as expected for the user. So those are two that are like out of the box. I'm always just going to have them on anything that I build. And then from that starting point, I'm going to start to think a little bit more about the specific use case, what could go wrong in production, and start building on top of that. But in terms of standard metrics to emphasize, I really think about like, what do LLMs normally just not do well? And hallucination is kind of the core there.
Makes a lot of sense. There's this question from Ali that says, if you have access to only a small set of real data and labeling them is very expensive or impossible, how do you create evals? I'm assuming the answer is somewhere around synthetic data generation, but I'll let you both take it.
Yeah, so synthetic data generation, I don't have too much experience for that. But generally, like I have experience with like human in the loop labeling. So what I would do in that case is I would label a small data set and then I would scale it up from there by having the developer learn from that data set, inspect it, and try to create an LLM as a judge metric that's actually going to kind of mimic the human labeling. So you can start to scale that out. But in terms of synthetic, Rachitt, I don't know if you might have more ideas there.
So I personally think that, again, this is more of a slightly advanced approach that I prefer taking, is that if we have a very small subset of real data, the prompt optimizers like DSPy actually have a programmatic way of improving and building evals. So this is a function known as bootstrap fine-tune in DSPy that effectively, if you give like 5 to 10 examples only, and you define your own custom metrics, like Claire mentioned, consistency, correctness, faithfulness, accuracy, any of these, you can define these as programmatic metrics there. So even we can absolutely, this is slightly advanced, you can absolutely just skip synthetic data there, and you can directly go after these advanced prompt optimization approaches only. So this gives you a very strong rubric grade prompt that helps you create the A, eval prompts, and B, keeps it model agnostic as well. If you're doing this with synthetic data, the best way to go about it, in my opinion, is to use multiple models, use multiple few shot examples, create multiple data sets, because different models have different thinking. You can look at different temperatures, different top P, top K values, and get different iterations of the same data set. So that's the most pragmatic way. And as Claire mentioned, then you build the metrics out of them. So that's how I would ideally do it.
Awesome. Makes a lot of sense. I think I want to kind of follow up on this as well. Like we've spoken about LLM judges or AI judges multiple times throughout this session. How do you folks decide if an LLM judge is ready, right? If it's mimicking what a human judge would do? Because who's judging the judge? That's kind of a question that we hear most of the times. Like, how do you make a call that, okay, this is ready to judge my AI responses?
I always get that question. I think it's the right question, because who's judging the judge? You end up in this kind of like circular logic where like, do I want to judge on my LLM judge to judge the judging? Like it gets a little bit messy logically. And it's correct, because like an LLM as a judge is just an additional source of uncertainty in your already non-deterministic system. And as a statistician, that kind of breaks my brain and makes me feel like it's not really a metric. But the way I like to think about LLM as a judge is it is a directional metric. It may not be like mathematically exactly accurate in terms of the numeric value, but it is directional. And if I see a spike in an LLM judge metric in production, it's always going to mean that like I need to go in there and inspect something and debug something. If I see a spike in hallucinations, it's actually happening, whether it's 8 or 10, like the numbers don't really matter. So I'm really looking at it as a directional indicator. In terms of knowing whether or not it's ready, I do like to test it on benchmark data sets, just to get a sense of how it would perform on data that I know. But then another thing you could do is like going back to like old school software engineering is like a dark deploy, where if you don't have that like data set to really test it on, like maybe just set it live, but like don't actually reveal the output of your system to the users and just collect real data in production. And you can start to collect a data set where you could label it and really get a sense of how things are performing, both for the system and the judge.
Rachitt, do you want to add?
The only thing I would add is that no LLM as a judge system is ever ready. It's going to keep changing. The only point the only difference in my approach is that I always prefer having an internal benchmark that is sort of looking outward, not from the user metric standpoint, but from the judge standpoint. So if you can even have like 5 to 10 questions that effectively are human picked or subject matter expert picked, you want to see how the LLM performed there. 5 to 10 questions, something that you yourself can very easily create in like a span of 10 minutes. You get a vibe check there. And then all the concepts we spoke about before, you take these concepts to production. So getting a vibe check is also very important. And of course, a V1, the V1 will always be, as Claire mentioned, that you will need to expose your evals to your users at some point. It's almost always a good idea to do it earlier rather than later. It's not premature optimization at all. In fact, it's the right thing to do.